Multi-hazards, all about protecting communities.
Wow, another season of Multi-Hazards is over. A new one is beginning. Join podcast host Vin Nelsen, that's me, as I share the stories and glories of this wonderful season covering March to August 2021. I'll give you a summary of each of Season 4's episodes and perhaps a few comments on them, and I can tell you a little bit of what we have in store for Season 5. Have a listen. But first, let's give a territorial acknowledgement. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Stalo, aka Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katsi, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Coquitlam peoples. These are the names of the First Nations groups who have inhabited this land around me since time immemorial, the land known as Greater Vancouver here on the west coast of Canada. So let's look at where we've come from. So I started this podcast in May 2020. I was inspired by all those awesome podcasts that I'd been listening to while I was usually jogging. For example, Doug Parsons' America Adapts, and then there's Disasters Deconstructed and Disaster Heroes. And I'd originally thought of doing a blog, but then I thought, hey, why not try a podcast? So then the COVID pandemic didn't hit me, but it hit my area in March 2020. So everything shut down and we were stuck at home, and we would just go out for essential services like grocery shopping, and we went to the parks often around us. And so honestly, it was a time to reflect on the world. And plus, despite a few interviews that I'd had in previous months to get into emergency management, the pandemic seemed to slow everything down that summer last year. Now, this is the 80th episode, or Season 5's inaugural episode. Each season has 20 episodes. Now, why did I settle on 20? Honestly, I don't know. 25 was another number I'd imagined, but I just thought that going over 20 was overdoing it. So I played around with the intro every once in a while. I had some cool music in Season 1. Then around Season 2, I did a rap that was quite comical. Now this past season, Season 4, I settled on a few seconds of cool music and then the sound of a storm. And then we get into the episode. So the basic intro in the first couple seconds that I've done, it goes multi-hazards. So that's remained the same. The format of the outro has stayed the same. I usually give a thanks to everybody, to my guests, to the audience. I give a disclaimer and then an encouragement. And then there's music following. Sometimes it's only 30 seconds and I cut it off, or I play the entire songs. And I get all those songs from YouTube Audio Library. Now, I've been doing study guides. They are PDFs. And usually what I do is I re-listen to the entire podcast, usually while I'm jogging. And then I go to my email and I put in a question for every few seconds of talk time. And I also get the photos from usually 3 websites. It will be Unsplash, that's the biggest source, and also Pexels. And then we have Pixabay. So they're very cool websites. I usually put 1 photo per page in the study guide, and then I will make a collage often with, say, 4+ photos, or I'll just pick 1 photo to represent the whole episode. And honestly, I don't know why, but I spent so much time selecting photographs for the episode, the main collage that will represent the entire episode. I don't know why. It's not easy to think of how a photo can represent what we've said during the kind of the oral episode. And honestly, it's great to have all these free websites, but often the best photos are the ones that you have to pay for, and I don't really want to pay, so I have to get it from these free websites. So once in a while too, I'll use the photos that I have taken myself. These study guides. Now, if you haven't checked them out, please do. They're awesome. I'm really proud of this work, and I hope that they can be used for schools and individuals who are learning these topics. I must admit, by far, the guests have been the most inspirational part of this for me. They are golden. I have learned so much. Now, to contrast this, I took 60 plus online and a handful of face-to-face university courses between April 2018 and December 2019. And I was cramming in knowledge about Indigenous studies, disaster studies, climate change, especially adaptation, cybersecurity, greenhouse gas and sustainability reporting, meteorology, first aid, business, finance, human resources, etc. So I ended up with 2 diplomas related to climate change and 3 related to emergency management. And then, as I said, I took a lot of other kinds of courses. It was a lot. And sometimes, though, I think that now, as I'm dealing with all the guests and preparing for the episodes and then following up, I think, honestly, I've been learning more than all that schooling I had done recently. So I try to keep in touch with the guests as best as I can, and that's really great too. I continually reach out to more people. Now, as time goes forward, I'm more interested in how the world in its current form is and how this affects the future. So, of course, as you know, we do disaster risk reduction, or some would call it emergency management. We do climate change, especially adaptation. And then there are many, many topics that we've also done, even, for example, built-in obsolescence. We've done climate activism. We've talked about anti-racism. And so there's a connection here. There's a connection between the world, how it's been built, and then what happens, for example, when disasters or other things strike. Now, honestly, what I've been finding out over the last few years of research is that we have an unjust, white, or Euro-centered system that we've built, which affects everything today, and of course, it will be affecting things in the future. This international Western privileging system has been established on the backs, the deaths, the genocide, the enslavement, and forced labor, the blood, sweat, and tears of Indigenous peoples, of Africans, and most other non-Western people. The West, and I'm part of it, has plundered the resources of the world. And China and other nations, they've been copying our example by using the resources and labor of Africa and elsewhere, including poor people domestically. So this very system has set out who gets hurt in disasters and who survives. And there you have it. As I said in one of the episodes, disasters mirror society. So nothing new is created and not much random happens. It's often the same old people getting hurt time and time again. And if you can't fix this in the today, then forget about protecting vulnerable people from disasters in the future. So needless to say, the podcast is an eye-opener for me. It's like putting together the pieces of a puzzle. The end result is shocking, and it's no fodder for a Harlequin romance story or movie, but it's there, and we have to deal with it. This is the world we live in. So I won't go much further here, but let's go on to look at each episode of Season 4. So we have the Season 4 premiere. That's a solo that I did, basically summarizing Season 3, which went from September 2020 to April 2021. And I remember that was kind of a hard season because I was going through a lot of struggles during the fall and winter and early spring. And we had a big wave. When was it? We had the second wave of COVID-19 where I live in October. And I remember I went out for a month doing landscaping in the rain, raking leaves. Really smart, huh? And then we had another big wave. It was our biggest one it was around April 2021. So yeah, it was kind of unnerving doing that. And honestly, I wasn't reaching out to as many people as I should have been. I was kind of uncertain about my schedule and everything. So it was a tough season, but there we go. That was the season premiere where I had basically told what I'm doing now too, but that was with the season 3 giving a synopsis. So then we had episodes 2 and 3, and I labeled it Protecting Communities, Promoting Love. Conversation with Vincent B. Davis. So I wrote here, emergency management should be Vincent B. Davis's middle name. He has seen it all, from civic to community to corporate, as he has endeavored to protect communities all over the United States. So here at the Multi-Hazards podcast, Vincent B. Davis and podcast host Vin Nelsen discuss how disasters mirror everyday life and how underprepared we really are. With compassion and empathy, Vincent shares the traumas of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lived experiences of Black Americans as racism lives on in all its ugliness. Vincent B. Davis is one of the rare truth tellers in emergency management, a man who doesn't sugarcoat things. Have a listen. And I have to give a shout out to Vincent B. Davis. He is so awesome. He's been kind of like a mentor to me, and I've actually talked to him casually, like in a Zoom calls before. And he's written a few awesome books too. Let me get them out and see what are the titles here. So I just discovered he has an awesome website. Actually, I think I knew this before, but I forgot about it. It's called preparednessmatters.net. Awesome website. I think he's redone it. It's really awesome. So he has from 2012, Lost and Turned Out, Preparing Underserved Communities for Disasters. And then in 2017, he has the Native Family Disaster Preparedness Handbook. And he worked on that with, 3 other people. And then he has a new one coming soon. It's called Preparedness Matters, the Black Community Guide to Surviving Natural and Human-Caused Disasters. So it says here he even has a podcast coming out called Preparedness Matters. Now that's kind of funny because he's actually been doing so many podcasts with me and other people over the last few years. So he's a great guy, and I really appreciated all the time that we had, and I hope I can stay connected. He's really active on LinkedIn, by the way, so if you ever connect with him on LinkedIn, he's always posting, and it's never dull. He always puts something that's very cool and eye-opening. So then we have episode 4, Coastal Resilience, that's Climate Change Adaptation, with Dr. Mushimi Chowdhury, and that's from April of 2021. That was really awesome. Now I'll read the synopsis. 40% of communities worldwide are on coastlines where they face enormous climate change impacts. Join Dr. Mushimi Chowdhury, Community Resilience Program Director of Coastal Risk and Resilience for the Nature Conservancy, and Multi-Hazards podcast host Vin Nelsen, as they discuss how coastal communities can become more resilient with our planet's ever-worsening climate crisis. Have a listen. So that was really wonderful. And Dr. Mushimi Chowdhury, she's been doing a lot with many countries around the world in trying to get them adapting to the changes in our climate, especially along the coastlines. And so we just talked about this one aspect of her work, but of course she's been doing a very multifaceted job with many countries and many aspects of climate change adaptation. So this was a really wonderful episode. And then moving on, we have episode 5. So that's called Tackling Uncertainty with Margaret Heffernan. And during my tough fall and winter last year, I had been reading her book, and it's called Uncharted: How to Navigate the Future. So let me just read the synopsis here. Uncertainty is a crucial issue in the COVID-19 pandemic and with other ongoing issues such as climate change, disasters, systemic injustice, the future of younger generations, etc. Join renowned author and speaker Dr. Margaret Heffernan and Multi-Hazards podcast host Vin Nelsen as they discuss uncertainty and the incredible findings from Margaret's latest book, Uncharted: How to Navigate the Future. Have a listen. So as I was saying, this was a really wonderful podcast, and Margaret, she gave me a lot of wisdom about uncertainty, and it's really amazing because if you go to other podcasts on Spotify, etc., Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, etc., and you look at YouTube, she has actually done so many different interviews on this whole topic of uncertainty, which she discussed a lot in the book Uncharted: How to Navigate the Future. So it gives you a lot of parameters about thinking about the future and about uncertainty, because we all like to be certain, but unfortunately for us, the world was not built in this way where certainty abounds. Oftentimes certainty is fake. So she reveals that too. She actually is encouraging us all to embrace uncertainty and to look at some of the parameters she lays out to kind of go through and just not be freaking out about uncertainty, but to build on the future in a healthy way. So just to let you know, she has a great website. It's www.mheffernan.com, and her name, Heffernan, is spelled Hefffernan. So that was wonderful. So moving on, we have episode 6, and this is actually a solo that I had done. This was on April 28th, 2021. So let me just read the synopsis. Disasters Mirror Society is an article written by Multi-Hazards host Vin Nelsen, inspired by his recent podcast with Vincent B. Davis. Disaster doc Mark Keim, MD, MBA, so graciously put the article on his website as a guest blog. Within the article are important lessons because the next few years and decades will be all about the vulnerable in pre, during, post-disaster work. Thanks to these wonderful experts and also Heather McGee, the sum of us, what racism costs everyone and how we can prosper together, and Deborah McKenzie, who wrote COVID-19, the pandemic that should never have happened and how to stop the next one, for their excellent scholarly work. And so, yeah, I was inspired by Heather McGee, and honestly, I have another podcast. It's called Be Strong to Be Useful. And I kept thinking, I should do a podcast just on this book, Heather McGee. And I wish she could actually come on this podcast. But anyways, I haven't done the summary. I've kind of got her book out of the library twice, and I was looking through and taking notes. I mean, there was a lot there. I learned so much this past spring from her. And then the summer before, when COVID was just getting heated up here where I live, there was this book by Deborah McKenzie on COVID-19, and she gave a great historical overview of pandemics and diseases, and it was just really awesome. And I think she had written this she published it around August of last year, I believe, July or August, but she basically rushed it, right? As soon as COVID started, where she was living in the UK, she rushed it. And but she had been a science writer for, I think it was like New Scientist, for many, many years. So she was ready. She had all the knowledge in her head to write all this. And so what I did is I put all this information together, and just to show that what is going on now in society, what has happened in the past, what is happening now, basically gets played out again through disasters. So it's kind of a sad topic, but it is reality. So, episode 7, It's called Racism and Conservatism in America and Beyond. Conversation with Dr. Robert C. Smith. So let me read this to you, the synopsis. Racism in the United States as well as other countries continues, not just through overt public discourse, but also in its overall system, in housing, banking, schooling, policing, etc. These policies especially affect African Americans as well as Indigenous people and other people of color. As Dr. Robert C. Smith, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at San Francisco State University, explained in his 2010 book, Conservatism and Racism and Why in America They Are the Same, policies that racially discriminate at ground level have found a home in the last half-century in the conservative movement. This has been their means of winning elections and supporters, from Barry Goldwater to Ronald Reagan, from Richard Cheney to Donald Trump. Even progressives have supported policies that end up hurting African Americans and other minorities in the United States of America. It's not just what you say, but the end result of your actions that constitute racism. And after decades of conservative policies on housing, jobs, policing, incarceration, the war on drugs, etc., have disproportionately impacted African Americans. Can this ever change? Will progressive movements that are anti-racist in nature win the day instead? So yeah, this was extremely interesting. Now, a funny note here, I don't know why I kept spelling conservatism wrong. I put it out there as conservatism. Is that right? Conservatism. Conservatism. So it should be conservatism, but conservatism. I put an extra syllable in there. Weird, huh? Anyways, I had been thinking this for many years, honestly, that the conservative movement is basically an apologist for capitalism, for the system as it is, and the people who support it, they kind of balk at change, unless it's, of course, it's some quick change to do with, building a dam or mining a mine or, some new stocks in the stock market. Then some quick change will happen. Or, for example, when a conservative leader will get in, for example, which happened in my province, I remember in the early 2000s, they get in and then they just cut so many services and they redo everything. It's kind of like a new austerity, and they claim that the last government, which was not conservative, had been overspending and they're going to balance the budget. So they end up taking the taxpayer money and they cut all these services, and then eventually, it always happens, they give it to their buddies in corporations because they have stronger ties with the corporations. So I would like to say that this is not limited to conservative parties, because as we've seen, centrist parties or centralist parties, they end up doing the same thing. And even left-leaning so-called progressive parties, they end up moving to the right when they get in power too. So there's a lot of promises coming from many of the politicians. They're promising this, promising that to the people. But at the end of the day, the system is they actually work for the bigger corporations and other interests. In a lot of ways, they're puppets. And so this plays into, or this is demonstrated by the racism that happens in the United States and in Canada. So it's a very deep topic. Many people have written many books on it. And so we just talked about what's been happening in the US, and especially during the 4-year tenure of Donald Trump. I mean, it was shocking, but it's actually a process that's been going on for hundreds of years. It was actually nothing new with Donald Trump. It's just that he was perhaps one of the most brazen about it, and even the Republican Party right now. Very brazen. But don't think that electing the other party changes everything. It changes some things. We could say that the hard edges are kind of softened, but same processes are going on. System change doesn't happen because you elect another party. So this is what we need to focus on for real change, and that is system change. So yeah, said a lot about that. It's a very big topic, but we're not going to get change in climate change adaptation or in disaster management until we focus on system change. Now, to switch it up, episode 8, it was about cross-cultural leadership with Diana Watson. So let me read the synopsis here. To be a leader is tough, and especially so in another culture. But cross-cultural success requires the right attitudes and skills. In this episode, world-renowned cross-cultural guru Diana Watson, a long-term resident of Taiwan but originally from the USA, shares her life and expertise on how to adapt to and learn a new culture. Whether you are a business person, traveler, hobbyist, NGO, or government worker, this episode contains vital information for you. Join us and become a learner and leader in world cultures. The YouTube video that brought instant recognition is Black Woman Wins Chinese Speech Contest English Subtitles from June 11th, 2018. And it's just a few shy of 3 million views. I think it's over 3 million by now. So yeah, this is where I found Diana Watson. She had done this speech in Chinese for Toastmasters and it went viral. So it has also been shared in an innumerable amount of times on other platforms such as WhatsApp, WeChat, Line, etc., which don't necessarily add to the YouTube number. So yeah, so many millions have actually watched that excellent speech that she gave in Mandarin Chinese. And so I connected with Diana. She was so gracious to come on the show, and we talked about cross-cultural leadership and what has been changing for her. She's African American. I think she's from Philadelphia, but she prefers to live in Taiwan. She's felt that place is her home. She really has adapted well. She loves the people there. They love her. And she's building a great business there to help the people from other countries and also the Taiwanese businesses to connect together. So yeah, cross-cultural leadership is very important, and Diana gives you lots of tips in this episode, and it's from May the 14th, 2021, so it was last spring. So moving on, we have episode 9, Food Security, conversation with Maddie Haig, and she's actually from Vancouver. I had connected with her because she had this kind of sustainable landscaping website that I was interested in, so I connected with her, and she had actually pivoted over to work in food security. So I contacted her and we did a great podcast together. And this is something I didn't really know about. So let me read the synopsis here. Where can we find emergency food for families and individuals who really need it? Food rescue or food recovery is where folks safely retrieve edible food, which otherwise goes to waste, and distribute it to those in need. This recovered food, such as fruits, vegetables, and proteins, can solve both problems of hunger and nutrition deficiency, potentially leading to diet-related disease and also food waste. Join us in this motivating and mind-expanding podcast with Maddie Haig, Program Manager of Food Stash in Vancouver, Canada. Now, I think I'm looking back. Did I make a mistake with my English there? Okay, so we have solving the problems of hunger and nutrition deficiency, potentially leading to diet-related disease and also food waste. No, I got that right, I believe. But yeah, they were they are still doing this. They're expanding this business, Food Stash in Vancouver, but fruits, vegetables, and proteins, they end up rescuing it and then distributing it to those people who have that nutrition deficiency and probably are eating a lot of cheap junk food. So they're getting better food when they're dealing with Food Stash in Vancouver. So yes, this was a very interesting episode, and honestly, I'd like to learn a lot more about this whole idea about food security. Now, moving on, we have episode 10, and that's basically where I did a synopsis of the podcast. So let me read what it says here. Yes, it's been a whole year of the Multi-Hazards podcast, and at the time, we are 70 episodes in now and running strong. Here, host Vin Nelsen answers questions such as, where's Multi-Hazards at now? What kind of praise and criticism have you received? How has Multi-Hazards changed you? How has the podcast assisted you with networking, with connecting with others who are professionals or lay people in the fields focusing on protecting communities? What's your method? How do you produce your podcast episodes? What are your plans? How do you see the future of the Multi-Hazards podcast? Join this episodes of Multi-Hazards and be a part of a movement to change the world. To change the world. Am I changing the world? Okay, I'm doing my little part. But that was an interesting episode. And let's see. What else can I say about it? I've had people give me some praise. And then I've also had somebody, I don't even know if they really did check out my episodes, but they were criticizing, I think it was the first few episodes of Summer there, saying I was complaining too much. So I had a rebuttal to that. And I probably should have said that, yeah, I took that praise and criticism to heart, and it did make me think about how I was doing things. And then also I talked about the difference between progressive and conservative movements. And honestly, I think I oversimplified there because there's a lot of differences, there's a lot of nuances, but the entire issue is not whether there's a conservative movement or progressive movement. The main issue is that it's a system that we've built over the centuries that is unjust, and it just keeps reproducing those ill effects, and we have to deal with systemic change, as I had mentioned before. So let's move on. Episode 11, Indigenous Activism and Climate Change Adaptation with Ghazali Ohorela, June 4th, 2021. So let me read the synopsis. Who is fighting for Indigenous rights, especially for climate change adaptation at the United Nations? Among the many articulate and courageous Indigenous rights advocates, did I say that right? Advocates is Ghazali Ohorela. His aim is to inspire and empower 476 million Indigenous people worldwide. And with the runaway climate crisis often treated lightly by the rest of the world, Indigenous people are in place to take a leading role in this existential challenge of the 21st century. Did I say that right? Existential? Join this exciting episode and learn the power and wisdom of Indigenous people the world over. So that was awesome. Now, Ghazali Ohorela, he does another podcast. It's called the Go Mulaku podcast, and it's awesome. He pumps out a lot of different episodes, like all the time. Like I just can't touch him. I can't keep up with him. It's just so much. It's really awesome. He is working with the United Nations. He's dealing with Indigenous peoples from around the world, and he puts so much on Instagram, on his podcast, and then he loads it all up to YouTube, something I should be doing, but I have been, I could say, not doing. And I won't say I'm lazy. It's just because I don't really think it's worth it. And it is a lot of work to put the stuff on YouTube, but who knows about the future. But Ghazali, he does that. He puts stuff out there, and he is really active. And he says he is trying to document his work now for his children and children's children and future generations. So this was a really great connection, and he made me really thankful and proud that I can have the privilege of dealing with so many Indigenous people just like him. And just to let you know, he's actually from a place called Molucco, which is an island claimed by Indonesia right now, which had been colonized by the Dutch. So yeah, it's a complicated situation, but he is fighting for the rights of his people to be independent and to be represented on the international stage. So let's move on. We have episode 12. It's called Faith, Community, and Climate Conversation with Areej Riaz. And that's from June 2021. Now, I was actually trying to get a podcast going with people from this organization. It was called let me get it right now. It's called the Community Climate Council, and this is in the Peel region in Ontario, which is actually near Toronto on the other side of Canada. And so I ended up with an enthusiastic person to be part of the podcast. So I decided to let her just talk about all the work and volunteering she's been doing. And so what ended up, it was just me and her doing the podcast, and perhaps later I will do a podcast with the Community Climate Council. We'll see. But let me read the synopsis here. How can faith and community influence our climate action? Look no further. Canada and the world are blessed to have people like Areej Riaz fighting for the planet and humanity. Areej is a climate change consultant based in Ontario, Canada, with a diverse industry background and in-depth knowledge and work experience from around the world. Her Muslim faith and community is one of the key strengths in her approach to life and the environment. She has contributed much, even at her young age, to global efforts in climate action, access to finance and technology, environmental education, and environmental sustainability. Join us and learn how to walk the talk when it comes to saving the planet and all the living creatures on it, including billions of people. And so she was involved, or she still is involved, with this group out of Ontario. It's called Enviro Muslims, and they have a website called enviromuslims.ca, and they actually published a really wonderful book. It's called Our Climate, Our Stories, a collection of stories and poems by Canadian youth. So it's basically a publication, and there's like lots of nice pictures and everything, and poetry and short stories written by young people, and not all of them are Muslim. They're from different backgrounds, and it was really awesome to talk to Areej Riaz. And just to be honest with you, in past podcasts, I think I had a couple, and it was dealing with Christianity and social justice. So I wanted to get people from other religions, and that's sort of my long-term goal, is to get people from many, many different religions to talk about the environment or talk about disasters or other aspects of life, because I believe that religious people and all the major and minor religions of the world, people and the adherents to these religions are very important for us to know about. And then especially as we deal with, say, climate change and disasters, we need to have their input. It's very crucial. So of course, in this world, Islam is a huge religion, and I wanted to talk with people who are connected to the Muslim community. And Areej Riaz, she was there for me, and she gave this awesome episode, this speech there, this interview, and I really enjoyed it, and I hope that I can be connecting with her and others like her in the future. This was really, really precious. And then moving on, we have episode 13. So this was from June the 19th, 2021, so just a couple months ago. and it's called Indigenous Climate Adaptation in Australia and Worldwide with Toni Hay. So let me read this synopsis here. Ironically, Indigenous peoples are least responsible for climate change, but will feel its effects the most, with all the storms, floods, diseases, etc. that it brings. How can they adapt better to this colossal challenge and help us all in our adaptation? How can Indigenous people and the rich knowledge of nature they bring become game changers? Join this eye-opening episode where Toni Hay, Indigenous climate expert from Australia, discusses the role Indigenous communities play and the solutions they offer. And so, I actually saw Toni Hay's LinkedIn post where she said she had finally published this book called Cultures of Inclusion, Indigenous Climate Adaptation. And I was really interested in it. So as soon as she published it, I got it on Amazon Kindle. And it was really a great read. I reached out to Toni. She did this episode with me. And I learned so much. Honestly, I've learned a bit about Australian history. I've seen some of their movies. I actually interviewed a climate scientist from there before. But this was a good chance to hear from someone who is Indigenous from Australia and to get her perspectives about what is happening there and how are Indigenous people actually not being included in climate change adaptation planning as they should be. So it was a very eye-opening episode. I really appreciate Toni and the book she wrote, and it is highly recommended. Go online and purchase it. It is really awesome. So moving on, we have episode 14th, and this was on June the 25th, 2021, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion in Emergency Management with Chauncia Willis. So here's the synopsis. How can emergency management, EM, change? Include different kinds of staff, better serve diverse communities. Join this multi-hazards episode as Chauncia Willis, co-founder and CEO of the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management, IDM, and seasoned EM practitioner herself, shows us the joys and benefits of making diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, part of every aspect of emergency management. Don't miss this episode. So this was really awesome. There's a great website for her organization, i-diem.org, so idm.org. And then she has a great website. It's basically chauncia.com, and Chauncia is spelled Chauncia. And then she has a really awesome book. It's called Stretching, and it's not necessarily about emergency management. It's just talking about America and how the country needs to, and I should say the United States of America, because of course when you say America, that includes everything from the northernmost to the southernmost part of the Americas. She was talking about, that's Chauncia, she was talking about America needs to have systemic change. And it has to happen in emergency management because, as it's been, emergency management in the United States has been very white-centered. It has been dominated by European people, especially men, and it needs to become diverse in its staffing. And that is especially true and important because the communities they serve are often not white. They're often diverse. And so you have European background people serving people from a diverse mix of the whole world. And it just doesn't work because there's bias there. So there has to be diversity in every part of emergency management. So that was a really eye-opening episode with Chauncia Willis. We have the next episode, 15, Black Emergency Managers Worldwide, conversation with Charles D. Sharp, and that was July the 2nd, 2021. Let me read the synopsis. Emergency Management EM is changing. Organizations like the Black Emergency Managers Association International, or BEMA International, are bringing in a rich diversity and expertise into fields that protect communities. Today we talk to CEO Charles D. Sharp about disaster risk reduction, DRR, climate change adaptation, CCA, working both at the community and global levels, focusing on influencing policy, the urgency of taking action now, and so many other topics. Join us for this exciting episode. So I really appreciated talking with Charles D. Sharp, and he has this group, which is representing Black emergency managers in the United States of America. I think he's actually got a few people from Canada too, and they participate also with a lot of international bodies or organizations. And so he has some really unique perspectives. And remember Vincent B. Davis that I had talked about before, and he did one of the earlier episodes. So he's been part of this organization also for many years. So it's good to see that things are changing in the United States and in many countries when it comes to protecting communities, but a lot more has to be done. And that's why we all need to listen to voices like Vincent B. Davis and Chauncey Willis and Charles D. Sharp. So Charles D. Sharp here, he really gave a great interview about why we should change things, shake them up, and why Black emergency managers should have a prominent role in protecting communities in the United States and beyond. So a wonderful episode with Charles D. Sharp, and I really want to keep in contact with him and many of the other organizations and people here from this season. Here where I live, apparently we've had more people die from the opioids crisis in the last, say, 5+ years than we have had from COVID-19 in the last year and a half. So the opioids crisis has been the reason why many times here around the region of Vancouver, you can hear ambulances because they're going to people who have been taking drugs. It's mixed with fentanyl or other kinds of opioids, and they end up just dying from that toxic poison that's put into their drugs. So episode 16 was the opioids crisis conversation with Guy, let me get his name right, Guy Felicella. And let me read the synopsis. The opioids crisis is ravaging our communities. How can we all respond in a better, savvier way? Join Guy Felicella, addiction educator, harm reduction advocate, and public speaker, and Multi-Hazards podcast host Vin Nelsen as they discuss how Canada, the US, and the world can work smarter in dealing with opioids and all addiction pandemics that we face. Have a listen. So this was really eye-opening. Guy Felicella had been living in this place that's actually very infamous in Vancouver. It's called the Downtown East Side. And we have people who are homeless there and people who are drug addicts. And it's a really tough place, but it is a community. There's lots of love between the people there, but they are suffering a lot. And they have often been abused by ongoing government neglect and bad policies. So Guy Felicella, he tells us all about what can actually work. And he is a big advocate for harm reduction. And basically, harm reduction is where instead of just forcing drug addicts to go cold turkey and get off drugs, is to gradually get them off of the drugs. So there's this website, it's called harmreduction.org. And basically it says here, harm reduction is a set of practical strategies and ideas aimed at reducing negative consequences associated with drug use. Harm reduction is also a movement for social justice built on a belief in and respect for the rights of people who use drugs. So basically what happens is it's meeting them where they're at. And it has a mix of strategies like safer use, managed use, abstinence, meeting people who use drugs where they're at, and addressing conditions of use along with the use itself. Okay, so it's not just a kind of a conservative reaction where you're just like, oh, yeah, cut these people off the drug supply, but it's a way to get them to survive, to not be killed by the drugs, and also to help them to eventually, some of them, maybe we could say many of them, will actually get off drugs, like Guy Felicella. And in particular, it's not just drugs in general, but it's also the opioids crisis. It has been really taking people, basically taking their lives, but it's also been really, really hurting people in many parts of the world. So moving on, we have the next episode that we're talking about, which is episode 17, Choosing Disasters or Not, with Dr. Ilan Kelman. That was on Friday, July the 16th, which is basically last month. And the synopsis says, how do human actions turn natural hazards into catastrophes for communities? The tragic truth is most disasters aren't natural. Instead, we choose them. That is, they're created or worsened by our choices. How can we take actions to save lives and preserve communities? So join Dr. Ilan Kelman, Professor of Disasters and Health, Multi-Hazards host Vin Nelsen, as they discuss how we can choose not to have disasters harming us so much. Have a listen. So basically, Dr. Ilan Kelman, he's written a new book. I think it's like from last year or a couple years. It's called Disaster by Choice, and it is really awesome. So I read it, and we were following up on this, basically talking about how humans have created disasters in so many ways, and then we choose these aspects of life, for example, to build our homes on floodplains, and we're basically choosing disasters because we're going overboard in what they call risk appetite and putting ourselves, our families, our businesses, our industries, everything we're doing at risk. So basically his book is about how to stop that and how to change our direction. So Ilan, he did so many YouTube videos on each chapter of his book. He did some podcasts, and I heard another one, I believe it was from Australia. So it's really awesome, the content of this book. And Ilan, he was very friendly, very kind, and this podcast was a real eye-opener. I really appreciate the time that he took. So yeah, that was that podcast. And let's move on to episode 18, Keeping Safe from Wildfire Smoke, with Dr. Sarah Henderson, Friday, July the 23rd, 2021. Wildfire smoke is no joke. How can we protect our communities from its harm, even as the climate changes and wildfires increase? Join Dr. Sarah Henderson, renowned scientist in environmental public health, and Multi-Hazards podcast host Vin Nelsen, as they discuss how we can adapt to the polluted skies as more wildfires engulf our forests and living spaces. Have a listen. So this is very timely, very important, because we had, I think it was over a week ago, wildfire smoke in our community outside of Vancouver for a couple days. And this smoke is very, very topic. And right now, as we speak, where I live in the province of British Columbia on the west coast of Canada, there are wildfires going everywhere. And I think it's like 300 plus. And I even have a family member who had to get out of the little town. It's just been causing a lot of people to be evacuated, and it's just been terrible. And the smoke is often one of the worst things about these wildfires, right? Of course, fire is bad, but the smoke, it can kill people. And you've heard stories that people die in building fires. Often it's not the fire itself, it's the smoke. And remember the old proverb, it says, where there's smoke, there's fire. Well, both of these things are very dangerous. And Dr. Sarah Henderson, she studied in depth the effects of wildfire smoke. And so it was just such a privilege to have her on the program talking about what we can do in our homes or outside or in our vehicles or in our buildings, what we can do about the wildfire smoke and how we can protect ourselves from it. So it's really wonderful. And she is actually a professor at the University of British Columbia near me. And she also works at the British Columbia Center for Disease Control, which has been very busy during the COVID epidemic, but her expertise is mainly right now with wildfire smoke, even though she can do so many things in regards to epidemiology. So thanks again to Sarah for being on this podcast. And then the next episode was 19, The Health Costs of Climate Change with Dylan Clark, the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. And this was July the 30th, 2021. Let me read the synopsis. As the climate changes for the worse, how can we protect our communities? Join Dylan Clark, Senior Research Associate at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, the network of experts producing independent research to bring clarity to the climate policy choices ahead for Canada, and Multi-Hazards podcast host Vin Nelsen as they discuss the challenges facing Canada and countries worldwide. Have a listen. So this was an excellent report put out by the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. And yes, it was called The Health Costs of Climate Change. We had a really great interview here with Dylan Clark. And yeah, he gave us so much important and valuable information about basically how it's costing Canadians a lot. And we need to do something about this, right? We need to do something in terms of mitigation, of course, but also in adaptation. And there's a lot of money that's going to be spent just to maintain the costs of Canadians and people around the world because of climate change. So that was a very eye-opening podcast. And so, last but not least, we have episode 20. It's called Unnatural Disasters with Dr. Gonzalo Lizarralde. That was from August the 5th, which is basically a few days ago, 2021. So the synopsis is here. Can our responses to disasters make things worse? How is it that our attempts to reduce risk or build back better mostly exacerbate social inequalities? And what can we do about it? Join Dr. Gonzalo Lizarralde as he shares his new book, Unnatural Disasters, Why Most Responses to Risk and Climate Change Fail, but Some Succeed. So this was a really wonderful episode. I really enjoyed it. And Dr. Gonzalo Lizarralde, or he asked me to call him Gonzalo. Yes, he opened my eyes to so many things, especially he was talking about this system that is developed now and it's ongoing of basically, we could call it neo-colonialism. We could call it imperialism, neoliberalism, but we have these policies and these practices that are ongoing. Basically, it's the global north abusing the global south, and it actually also happens to the communities that we have made poor here in the global north. And it's just this systemic failure, which is basically in line with that previous podcast I had done where I said disasters mirror society. So yeah, we have these disasters, but they are not natural because they take the social inequalities which are there already and it makes things worse. So when you talk about build back better, it's often another way for these flashy consultants who come from Western countries to go into poor communities or to the global south and basically try out all these experiments of things, and then they kind of leave halfway or even before halfway, and people are left holding the bag. And it's like, can we make some solutions for disasters where people are respected and where there are actually good results that happen, not these, fancy experiments and people in poorer countries end up being guinea pigs. So yes, this was a really awesome episode, and it lines up with some of the former ones that I had done, like the one with Disasters by Choice by Dr. Ilan Kelman, and as I mentioned, Disasters Mirror Society, the one that I had done on my own and inspired by Vincent B. Davis. So yeah, as I was saying before, that many of the things that I've been doing on this podcast, they're kind of building upon each other. It's like the pieces of a puzzle coming together. Now let's take a look at season 5. We have some episodes lined up so far. Cross our fingers. Hopefully all will go well. But the topics include emergency warning systems. We also have best practices for the usage of climate projections in climate adaptation projects. We also have conspiracy theories. We have empire and racism, and we have environmental racism. So many interesting things. Now, on a personal note, we're in the 4th wave of COVID-19. We've got the Delta variant spreading where I am, and the numbers are going up day by day. I think it was just like a month ago that we were at like under 100. I think it was like 35 cases per day. Now we're at almost 450 per day. So it's just been a month. So the Delta variant, it basically grows exponentially. Yeah. And yeah, I will be changing some of my personal life during the late summer and early autumn. So I hope it doesn't negatively affect this podcast, and I will try to make sure everything goes smoothly. And also, let me tell you, the more I do podcasts and study about these things, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, diversity, equity, and inclusion, Indigenous rights, the more I love it. It's been a really awesome journey, and I want to thank all of you, my listeners, for being here on this journey with me. Let's keep going. Now, to end off this episode, I want to just thank you for being with me. An important disclaimer here. First, this podcast is meant to be educational and does not try to offer legal, medical, or other specific professional or expert advice unless otherwise noted. And second, the opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the organizations that either my guests or I are working with. So, here as I conclude this episode, thanks to all of you dearest listeners for joining me here today. Stay safe out there and stay tuned for more episodes. This is Vin Nelsen wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. Cheers to you all. Peace out.